Hi, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. This is the first Casualty by Philip Knightley. It was originally published in 1975, and the title is based off of this quote: "The first casualty when war comes is truth," and that was Senator Hiram Johnson in 1917. And first chapter: The miserable parent of a luckless tribe, 1854 to 1856. At 10 minutes past 11, our light cavalry brigade advanced. They swept proudly past, glittering in the morning sun in all the pride and splendor of war. At the distance of 1,200 yards, the whole line of the enemy belched forth, from 30 iron mouths, a flood of smoke and flame. The flight was marked by instant gaps in our ranks, by dead men and horses, by steeds flying wounded or riderless across the plain, in diminished ranks, with the halo of steel above our heads, and with a cheer which was many a noble fellow's death cry. They flew into the smoke of the batteries, but ere they were lost from the view, the plain was strewn with their bodies. Through the clouds of smoke we could see their sabers flashing as they rode between the guns, cutting down the gunners as they stood. We saw them riding through, returning, after breaking through a column of Russians and scattering them like chaff, when the flank fire of the batteries on the hill swept them down. Wounded men and dismounted troopers flying toward us told us the sad tale. At 35 minutes past 11, not a British soldier, except the dead and the dying, was left in front of the Muscovite guns. This account of the charge of the Light Brigade was written by William Howard Russell, according to his epitaph in St. Paul's Cathedral, the first and greatest war correspondent. The greatest is open to dispute, and he was not the first. That title probably belongs to the Morning Post man G. L. Grunison, but Russell's coverage of the Crimean War marked the beginning of an organized effort to report a war to the civilian population at home using the services of a civilian reporter. This was an immense leap in the history of journalism, so it is appropriate to begin with Russell, because, whether or not the first and greatest, he was certainly, as he put it himself, the miserable parent of a luckless tribe. Before the Crimea, British editors either stole war news from foreign newspapers or employed junior officers to send letters from the battlefront, a most unsatisfactory arrangement, for not only were these soldier correspondents highly selective in what they wrote, regarding themselves first as soldiers and then as correspondents, they also understood little of the workings of newspapers or even what constituted news. The Times engaged one such military privateer, Lieutenant Charles Nasmyth of the East India Company's Bombay Artillery, soon after war broke out with Russia in 1854. He did not last long. "I wish you would impress upon Nasmyth with all your eloquence the absolute necessity of writing as often as he can and sending his letters without delay," the Times manager, Mowbray Morris, wrote to the Constantinople correspondent, Thomas Cheney. "The idea of a newspaper correspondent keeping a journal of the siege until after the affair is over has driven me wild." Morris and the Times editor, John Delane, realized that traditional methods were not going to work in the Crimea. Britain's declaration of war had resulted in an upsurge of enthusiasm that had surprised everyone. "The war," Queen Victoria wrote, "is popular beyond belief." The workers, who genuinely hated Tsarist absolutism, took to the streets shouting slogans and singing patriotic songs. Britain felt that Russia, ambitious to expand her empire, had to be stopped from establishing herself in Europe, and since the British army was the finest, most powerful army in the modern world, it was up to her to undertake the task. Such a popular war created an unprecedented demand for news. The excitement "The painful excitement for information beggars all description," wrote one minister. The Times, whose circulation was greater than that of all of its rivals put together, must meet this demand. "The public expects that we shall have our own agents," Morris wrote, "and as it has been long accustomed to look to the Times for the truth in all things, we disappoint a reasonable expectation when we offer nothing better than reports from other journalists, however authentic. Various trials of locally hired correspondents, such as Nasmyth, having failed, Delane decided, in February of 1854, to send Russell from London, at first only to accompany the guards, who were being sent as a precautionary measure to Malta. Later, when this arrangement worked well, he sent him to the front. Russell, a stocky Irishman, who in the tradition of journalists had forced his way into the paper by a mixture of cunning, persistence, and solid reporting, turned out a fortunate choice. For one, Delane had found that Russell had a flair for war reporting. He kept him to it, increasing both the paper's prestige and its correspondence. Russell covered the war between Schleswig-Holstein and Denmark, the Crimean War, the Indian Mutiny, the American Civil War, the Austro-Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune, and the Zulu War of 1879. He helped topple the British government, was indirectly responsible for the employment of the first war photographer, and helped keep Britain from intervening in the American Civil War. He was appointed a Knight of the Iron Cross, an officer of the Legion of Honor, and Chevalier of the Order of Franz Joseph of Austria. He was also awarded the Turkish War Medal, the Indian War Medal, and the South African War Medal. He started a newspaper, the Army and Navy Gazette, became a friend and honorary private secretary of the Prince of Wales, wrote books, stood for Parliament, and married a countess. He filled his flat in London with war trophies, a lot of them loot, saw surmounting its horrors the glory of war, and despite his battles with the establishment, remained basically an establishment figure, fascinated by all things military. One has the feeling that if he had not been a war correspondent, he would have been a soldier, no doubt a general. Like many of the, quote, luckless tribe he sired, Russell was deeply insecure. Delane could keep him working only by an almost constant flow of praise for his style, his initiative, his perception. But his war reporting was considerably closer to the truth than anything the public had previously been permitted to learn, and his influence on the conduct of the Crimean campaign was immense. Russell was born in Lilyvale, County Dublin, on March 28, 1820 or 1821. Early attracted by military life, he used to get up at dawn to watch the soldiers drilling at a nearby barracks, and he tried several times to enlist until his grandfather stopped him. So, instead, he went in for street battles with undergraduates from Trinity College, who were mostly Orangemen, against Roman Catholic community, particularly the coal porters. There was a glorious doings, particularly during the election times. We frequently parted with broken heads, but sometimes we had it all our own way and made the most of it. Russell briefly thought of becoming a doctor, but was shaken by the sight of bodies, an aversion he later overcame on the battlefield, and was still considering a career when, in 1841, his cousin, sent by the Times to cover the Irish elections, hired Russell to help him. Russell quickly showed the journalistic initiative that later greatly helped his career. The other reporters, Russell decided, would station themselves at various meetings, and since they could not cover them all, would miss the broad picture. With his knowledge of political tactics gained from his street-fighting days, Russell reasoned that one place through which most of the participants in an Irish election would eventually pass was the local hospital. So he stationed himself in the casualty ward and interviewed the candidates and their opponents as they were carried in. He wrote a good, impassioned account of the violence, which the Times produced, and which it followed a few days later with a leading article or editorial. Russell was in. He was subsequently invited to London to meet editor Delane, and a loose freelance arrangement was worked out. In August 1844, Delane sent Russell back to Ireland to cover the trial of Daniel O'Connell, the Irish leader who had been charged with seditious conspiracy. The story of how Russell got his scoop illustrates the physical stamina required in the days before the telegraph, and shows the sort of competition correspondents faced even in that leisurely period. Both the Times and its rival, the Morning Herald, had chartered special steamers to carry the news and the results of government prosecution to London, Russell wrote later. It was very late on a Saturday night when the jury retired and the other newspapers' correspondents left to get refreshments. I was sitting outside the court wondering whether I should go to bed when my boy rushed up to me. "Jury just coming in," he said. "They brought in a verdict of guilty." The moment I heard it, I flew from the court, jumped into a carriage and drove to the station, where I ordered a special train to be in readiness. Got to Kingstown, hailed the Iron Duke, the steamer chartered by the Times, got up steam within half an hour, and left with consolation that the Morning Herald steamer was lying peacefully in harbour. Arrived in Holyhead, sped on a special train to London, tried to sleep, tight boots, couldn't, so took 'em off. Reached Euston, tried to sleep, Times, man waiting with cab, struggled with boots, only managed left foot, ran into left Times office with one boot under my arm. As I entered Printing House Square, the Times office, man in shirt sleeves I took to be the Times printer came up and said, "So glad to see you safe over here, sir. So they found him guilty." "Yes, guilty, my friend," I replied. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a man posted outside the Times by the Morning Herald, and it came out the next day with the news as well. In February 1854, Delane called Russell to his office and asked him to accompany a British force to Malta. Russell was not enthusiastic. He said he did not want to be away from his wife and 2 children, but Delane persuaded him by assuring him he would be back for Easter. It was 2 years before he saw London again. Russell remained at Malta until March 30th, and then sailed with the British force to Gallipoli. From there, he began sending the dispatches in the form of letters to Delane that were to make him famous. Russell was not quick to realize that all was not well with the British army. Was quick. It had not fought or even engaged in large-scale foreign maneuvers since Wellington had beaten Napoleon at Waterloo almost 40 years earlier. There was no single war office, and the command was dominated by noble blood. The expedition's leader was Lord Raglan, a very British hero, who had been military secretary to the Duke of Wellington. Raglan was brave. When a surgeon at Waterloo cut off his arm without anesthetic, Raglan said only, "Bring my arm back, there's a ring my wife gave me on the finger." And it was also a highly competent staff officer, but he was 65 and never commanded so much as a battalion on the field. He was hampered by perhaps the worst collection of subordinate officers ever concentrated in one army, including the Earl of Cardigan, the hard-drinking commander of the Light Brigade. The British officers brought a French chef, Kaffir servants, and their favorite horses and wines, their shotguns, dogs, and in some cases their wives. A party of, quote, traveling gentlemen, end quote, later turned up, wealthy young Englishmen who had come out to watch the war, as they might have attended a cricket match at Lord's. The French, who had declared war on Russia a day before Britain, could not believe the British were serious, and neither could Russell. "The management is infamous," he wrote to Delane, "and the contrast offered by our proceedings to the conduct of the French most painful. Could you believe it? The sick have not a bed to lie upon. They are landed and thrown into a rickety house without a chair or table in it. The French, with their ambulances, excellent commissariat staff, and boulangerie, in every respect are immeasurably our superiors. While these things go on, Sir George Brown only seems anxious about the men being clean-shaved. their necks well stiffened and waist belts tight. He insists on officers and men being in full rig, no loose coats, jackets, etc. Later, Russell passed to Delane the problem that has faced many a war correspondent. Am I to tell these things or hold my tongue? Delane told him to go ahead, and those letters of Russell's that he did not use in the Times, no doubt from apprehension that the Times would be accused of being unpatriotic, he circled among cabinet ministers, beginning a process that was eventually to topple the government. But Russell was not the only correspondent to notice these deficiencies. The year before he arrived in the Crimea, the London Daily News had appointed Edwin Lawrence Godkin, another Irishman, to go to Turkey for the hostilities, end quote. Godkin, who was only 22, had considerable advantage, an honest assessment of his capabilities. He had written, in an article for the News advocating the claims of the Greeks to Constantinople, I know nothing about either Greece or the Greeks or Constantinople, but I was possessed of that common illusion of a young man. That facility in composition indicates the existence of a thought. Godkin wandered around the army, watching the preparations for battle, and was alarmed at what he saw. From Varna, on the Black Sea, he predicted the breakdown of the British supply lines. I do not know whether the British Commissariat officials know exactly what difficulties they will have to contend with, but certainly from what I have heard and saw at Scutari, I rather think not. I am supported in my conclusions by this point of a piece of folly committed the other day in sending an officer to travel Romania and Bulgaria with a view to ascertaining what facilities there existed in them for supplying the English cavalry with horses. The ignorance which dictated this step is scarcely conceivable. A single interrogatory addressed into the consul here at Varna, for example, would have elicited the fact that there are not 500 horses in all European Turkey fit to mount an English dragoon. When mistakes such as these are made regarding matters in it, which information lies in the reach of most careless observer, one is naturally led to fear that many blunders and oversights may be first committed in departments where knowledge is more difficult of access. Folly, ignorance, mistakes, blunders, oversights, this was the wrong stuff. The Times was supporting Russell's strictures in its editorial comments, and with two newspapers openly attacking it, the army found itself on the defensive, its worst fears about the nature of the press fully confirmed. Godkin later recalled what happened when the British consul at Varna introduced an elderly and distinguished Times correspondent to General Sir George Brown. A shudder seemed to pass through his fame at the mention of the Times. He maintained a dead silence while the correspondent remained in the room, as if the slightest utterance of his presence might endanger the monarchy. Lord Raglan had decided not to recognize the correspondents, not to give them rations or assistance, and to look the other way at any efforts by junior officers to discourage them. This took the form, with Russell, of cutting down his tent when he pitched it within the lines, forcing him out with the camp followers. But Russell clung on and was with the army when it moved to Crimea in September 1854. Cholera broke out as the British were preparing to march, but they continued their advance and on September 20th crossed the Alma River, putting a superior Russian force to flight. This was Russell's initiation into some of the problems of his trade. He had decided that he should wear some sort of uniform, and had got together a gold-banded commissariat officer's cap, a rifleman's patrol jacket, cord breeches, butcher's boots with huge spurs, and a large sword. He had brought a horse, a fiddle-headed, ewe-necked beast, with great bone and not much else. From there, where should he watch the battle? I was never in a more unpleasant situation. Everyone else on the field had some reason to appear. I had none. They were unrecognized business. It could scarcely be recognized or legitimate business for any man to ride in front of an army in order that he might be able to write an account of battle for a newspaper, a view he was soon to change. Russell rode up and down behind the action, making several attempts to attach himself to the entourage of divisional commanders, all of whom sent him packing. He saw little of action, and what he did see unnerved him, so he resorted to the tactics that had first brought him to the notice of the Times, which during the Irish elections, and that have been the basis of a war correspondent's modus operandi since. He stopped every officer and soldier he could and asked him to describe what had happened. At first, the jumble of impressions Russell recorded only confused him further. How was I to describe what I had not seen? Where to learn the facts for which they were waiting at home? My eyes swam as I tried to make notes of what I had heard. I was worn out with excitement, fatigue, and lack of food. I had been more than 10 hours in the saddle. My wretched horse, bleeding badly from a cut in the leg, was unable to carry me. Me head was throbbing. Me heart was beat as though it would burst. I suppose I was unnerved by want of food and rest, but I was so much overcome by what I saw that I could not remain where the fight had been closest and deadliest. I longed to get away from it, from the exultation of others in which thought the dead was forgotten or unexpressed. It was now that the weight of task I had accepted fell on my soul like lead. Russell was too confused and depressed to write his account that night, so he slept and began his task the next morning, sitting on the parapet of the Russian redoubt, writing with an inkpot and quill pen in the yellow pages of a dead Russian's account book. An officer of engineers eased his discomfort by making a writing table for him with a plank laid across 2 casks. Russell wrote a version of the battle, but it was dissatisfied with it, and he requisitioned many officers and clarified the situation slightly. He found what most correspondents soon discover: eyewitness accounts are frequently contradictory. Then he rewrote his story of the battle. It was peppered with what were to become the cliches of war. There was a rain of death, and grape shot tore through the enemy ranks as the British troops poured in a steady fire from their point-blank distance. Russians were very terrible enemy, and the British troops were gallant. Even in these early days of war, correspondence, 2 distinct techniques were emerging. Russell was basically a battlefield correspondent trying to report the overall scene, to give a contemporary observer's account of how a battle was lost or won. Godkin, although he had a hatred of war, was interested in its effects of the individual, including himself. Here is Russell describing an attack. At 5 minutes before 12 o'clock, the French, like a swarm of bees, issued forth from their trenches close to the domed Malakoff, scrambled up its faces, and they were through the embrasures in the twinkling of an eye. They crossed the 7 meters of the ground which separated them from the enemy in a few bounds, and in a minute or 2 after the head of their column issued from the ditch, the tricolour was floating over the Kornilov bastion. Compare this with Godkin describing what happened to a young French conscript, beardless, slender, and hardly able to trot under his musket, fitter to be by his mother's side than amidst the horrors of a heady fight, who is stopped by panic-stricken retreat by a general. The general rushed towards him, tore one of his cotton epaulets off his shoulder, and shouted in his ear, "Comment, vous ne savez pas ça, donc?" The reproach stung the poor boy in the quick. All his fiery, chivalrous French blood rose up to him to repel it. His face flushed up, and constantly repeating, "Je ne sais pas, Francois," and he ran back, mounted the top parapet, whirled his musket about his head in a fury of excitement, and at last fell into the ditch, riddled with balls. Both types of reports were eagerly read in Britain, but the Times carried more weight, having by now become, in its own words, the chief recorder of events of the war, but counted among the protagonists. under pressure from the times, Russell's lot improved. He followed the invasion force across the Alma and onto Balaclava, where it camped. By the time the guns had been unloaded, the Russians had strengthened their fortifications, and the first assault against them on October 17th failed. A week later, Russians counterattacked. This time, there were none of the difficulties Russell had encountered. At the Alma, he joined the British command on a plateau overlooking Balaclava, from where he could see the disaster that followed, as the stage and those upon it are seen from the box of a theatre. Before him was the green valley, framed with the mountain ranges on all sides, and with the harbor shining on the right. Below, the wheeling squadrons of cavalry appeared to be executing a parade drill for the benefit of the spectators, but they were not drilling. They were plainly retiring before a superior enemy. Lord Raglan and his staff shared the view. Everything was clear to them, and in this, Russell decided later, lay the seeds of tragedy. "I am persuaded," he said, "that whatever there was of disaster and misfortune on the 25th of October 1854 was due, first, to the distance of Lord Raglan from the field, and secondly, from his failure to understand that he saw more than his generals below could see. Therefore, he did not take pains in wording his orders to make it so plain to them that explanation of his meaning was not needed. Lord Cardigan was ordered to, quote, advance rapidly with the light brigade and prevent the enemy, quote, carrying away the guns. In front of the light brigade were the Russian guns. The British guns, which were being carried away, were on the right. Cardigan could not see them. He charged with his brigade directly into the Russian artillery, muttering, so it is said, "Here goes the last of the Brutinels." Of the 673 men who also charged down the mile-long valley, fewer than 200 returned. The officers on the hilltop sat stunned as the remains of the light brigade trotted back. Russell wrote in his diary, "I looked at the group of officers representing them much impressed with confidence by what I saw," but his account for the Times concentrated on the glory of the event, the pride and splendor of the time of the war. The British public reacted with shocked pride. A cartoon in Punch showed a mother and her children sitting with excited and tearful faces, while the head of the household, brandishing a poker over his head, reads to them from the Times Russell's account of the Light Brigade's suicidal charge. This setback to the campaign was followed by the bloody but inconclusive Battle of Inkerman on November 5th, 1854. Russell was appalled by the casualties and wrote privately to Delane, saying that he felt Raglan to be incompetent. "He is a good brave soldier, I am sure, and a polished gentleman, but he is no more fit than I am to cope with any leader of strategic skill." And Godkin, in an outburst against the leadership in general, noted in his diary, "Oh, the sluttin' aristocracy." Delane circulated Russell's letters to his friends in the cabinet, but conditions were to grow even worse. The Russian winter set in, and Russell grew caustic in his criticism of the suffering of the soldiers had to endure. His dispatches dwelt on the pitiful condition of the troops and command's lack of concern. As the Times continued to attack Raglan for his leadership, the army began to retaliate. Russell, who had been living in a tiny room in a squalid house that he had shared with some Turkish soldiers, their horses and cattle, and the decomposing body of a Tartar in the only well, was asked to move out to make way for some more soldiers, and had to seek shelter in the tents of those of his friends who were still on speaking terms with him. A letter to Delane on January 17, 1855, tells of his despair. "This army has melted away almost to a drop of miserable, washed-out, worn-out, spiritless wretches, who muster out of 55,000 just 11,000 now fit to shoulder a musket. but certainly do not fit to do duty against the enemy. Let no one at home attempt to throw dirt in your eyes. This army is, to all intents and purposes, with the exception of a very few regiments, used up, destroyed, and ruined. My occupation is gone, and there is nothing to record more of the British expedition except its weaknesses and its misery. Misery in every form and shape except that of defeat. From that we solely are spared by the goodness of heaven, which erects barriers of mud and snow between us and our enemies. On Delane's advance, continue as you have done, to tell the truth, and as much of it as you can, and leave such comment as may be dangerous to us who are out of danger. Russell continued to catalogue the army's misfortunes and to supply private information for Delay's leading articles. The government continued publicly to deny the accusations, while privately bombarding Raglan with panic-stricken queries. What had gone wrong? What could be done to save both the army and the reputation of the government? One simple way, tried many a time since the Crimea, seemed to be to get rid of war correspondent causing all the trouble. At one time or another, most of the senior British officers, except Raglan, who never acknowledged his existence, came up to Russell and said, "If I were you, I'd go away. I would indeed." Raglan's tactics were more dangerous. He got the deputy judge advocate to claim that Russell's dispatches had involved serious breaches of security and had afforded assistance to the enemy. That they were breaches of security was undoubtedly true. In one article alone, published in the Times on the 23rd of October 1854, Russell revealed the number of pieces of artillery that had been moved to the front, the position and amount of gunpowder needed to supply them, the exact positions and names of 2 regiments, and the fact that there was a dearth of round shot. Since this was no doubt telegraphed to Russia the day it appeared in London, even Delane agreed that Russell should be curbed, and he told the government he would, quote, confine all his correspondence exclusively to the version of past events. It is doubtful, however, that Russell's dispatches afforded much assistance to the enemy. After the war, the Russian commander at Sevastopol was emphatic in saying that he never learned anything from the Times that he had not already been told by his spies. Once the public had been fully aroused to the state of the army in the Crimea, reaction was rapid. The government, at first worried only because recruiting might be affected, soon had to face an angry Times demanding that army's medical services be reformed or removed. That eventually took Florence Nightingale, a nurse of professional skill, to the war. Russell is usually credited with being responsible for her place in history, but the facts are different. Godkin was the first to foresee the strain the medical services would be under. As early as January 1854, he had written, "One would imagine that thousands of young surgeons who are starving in England and France would flock here to fill up the vacancies which exist in every regiment." But nothing was done. It was true that Russell wrote movingly about the sufferings of soldiers on the field, but it was actually Thomas Cheney, the Constantinople correspondent of the Times and its future editor, with his descriptions of conditions at the base hospital in Scutari, on the opposite side of the Bosporus from Constantinople, was created the biggest impact in England. In a dispatch published October 12th, Cheney wrote, "It is with feelings of surprise and anger that the public will learn that no sufficient medical preparations have been made for the proper care of the wounded. Not only are there not sufficient surgeons, that, it might be urged, was unavoidable. Not only are there no dressers and nurses, that might be a defect of system for which no one is to blame, but what will be said when it is known is that there is not even linen to make bandages for the wounded. The greatest commiseration prevails for the suffering of the unhappy inmates of Scutari, and every family is giving sheets and old garments to supply their want. But why could not this clearly foreseen event have been supplied? It rests with the government to make enquiries into the conduct of those who must have so greatly neglected their duty. The Times supported Cheney's article with an editorial appeal for the private charity to come to the rescue. The following day, the Times carried a number of letters offering money, including one from Sir Robert Peel, the son of the former Prime Minister, who set out a scheme for supplying comforts to the sick and wounded, and promised £200 for such a cause. In the news columns of the same issue, October 13th, the Times ran a further dispatch from Cheney. This and the earlier dispatch have been since wrongly attributed to Russell, a mistake that was probably the origin of the legend that it was one of Russell's dispatches which moved Miss Nightingale to offer her services. Cheney wrote, "The worn-out pensioners who were brought out as an ambulance corps are totally useless, and not only are surgeons not to be had, but there are no dressers or nurses to carry out the surgeon's directions and to attend to the sick during intervals between his visits. Here the French are greatly our superiors, their medical arrangements are extremely good, their surgeons are more numerous, and they also have the help of the Sisters of Charity, who have accompanied the expedition in incredible numbers. These devoted women are excellent nurses." The next day, the Times carried a letter signed, "A sufferer by the present war," who asked, "Why have we no Sisters of Charity?" and added, "There are numbers of able-bodied and tender-hearted Englishwomen who would joyfully and with alacrity go out to devote themselves to nursing the sick and wounded." Later, the same day, Miss Nightingale wrote to her friend, Miss Sidney Herbert, the wife of the Secretary for War, saying, "I do not mean to say I believe the Times accounts, but I do believe that we may be of use to the wounded wretches," and setting out a scheme for recruiting a private nursing corps. Her letter crossed with one from Herbert himself, asking her to go to the war as the accredited head of a government nursing service, which she promptly agreed to. No doubt Russell's reports had helped in general to contribute to this, but long overdue credit must go to Cheney for his dispatches from the Scutari. As money and crates of clothing for the Crimean army poured into the Times office, the paper switched its criticisms of the government to the high command in the field and began to demand the recall of Lord Raglan and his staff. At the end of January 1855, the government succumbed, railing to the last at the Times and Russell. If Russell felt any sense of triumph, there is little evidence of it. He was preoccupied with the erection of a prefabricated iron hut, and the Times had sent him from London, and probably in preparation for the battle that he knew would eventually come with the Times accountants. In cataloguing living cost, £5 for a ham, 15 shillings for a small tin of meat, 5 shillings for a little pot of marmalade, £6 for a pair of seaman's boots, and £5 for a turkey. At this stage, someone in the establishment, possibly Prince Albert, had realized that to restore the public confidence in the conduct of the war, some form of counter-propaganda was necessary, and what better form could there be than newly discovered medium that never lied, the camera? According to Roger Fenton, an unsuccessful painter and one of the founders of the Royal Photographic Society, who frequently photographed the royal family, was encouraged to go out to the Crimea to record what was happening. With letters of introduction from Prince Albert, Fenton arrived at Balaclava on March 8, 1855, and set about establishing an axiom that still lie brilliantly by omission. Fenton's photographs, technically excellent though they are, portray a war where everything looks shipshape and everyone happy. They show well-dressed officers and men eating, drinking, or smoking, ships in Balaclava harbor, a convivial party between French and English troops, Lord Raglan looking rather drawn, a group of happy Zouaves and Turks, quiet scenes at a mortar battery, and the interiors of captured forts after the bodies had been removed. Yet in the valley, where the charge of the Light Brigade had taken place, Fenton noticed, and described in a letter, this macabre reminder of what the war was really like. We come upon so many skeletons half buried. One was laying as if he had raised himself on his elbow, his bare skull sticking up with still enough flesh left in the muscles to prevent it from falling from the shoulders. Another man's feet and hands were of the ground, and shoes on the feet and flesh gone. Fenton did not bother to unpack his camera. He knew the sort of photograph he should take, and this was not one of them. Fenton and Russell never worked together, and Fenton, having finished his assignment, returned to England to collect the royal praise he felt he deserved. To be fair, the two other photographers of the Crimean War, James Robertson and the Frenchman Charles Langlois, did little better. In mid-June, the Allies launched a major attack on Sevastopol, which failed. Russell blamed Raglan for having allowed his plans to be influenced by the French. The disaster found Raglan at the end of his strength. He sickened and 10 days later died. Florence Nightingale wrote to her parents that he died without sufficient physical reason. He was so depressed. He was not a very great general, but he was a very good man. There was a shift of sentiment in Britain. Queen Victoria let it be known that she was displeased with the Times and attacks on Raglan. Prince Albert called Russell the miserable scribbler. Sidney Herbert, the former Secretary of War, wrote, "I trust the army will lynch the Times correspondent." And there were the suggestions that the behavior of the Times and Russell was little short of treason. This helped the new commander-in-chief, Sir William Codrington, to acquire more support in the form of restraint on the press. After a consultation with Lord Panmure, Secretary of War, whose only suggestion for handling war correspondence was to put it to their patriotism and honor whether they would endanger the success of the army by premature and impromptu publication of its number, conditions, etc. Codrington issued a general order on February 25, 1856, that must rank as the origin of military censorship. It forbade the publication of details of value to the enemy, authorized the ejection of a correspondent who, it was alleged, had published such details, and threatened future offenders with the same punishment. This historic step was taken too late. By the time news of it reached Britain, hostilities had ceased, and its importance was over-involved in a major war against the Boers. Censorship was accepted as a necessary and just, and it became the dominating feature of the reporting of the First World War, crushing correspondence into virtual silence. Russell returned to London in fame. The Times made the gesture every war correspondent dreams of. It put aside his IOUs for advance expenses and told him he could start again with what tradesmen call a clean slate. He was placed on the list of the Times foreign correspondents at £600 a year, providing you will render monthly accounts of your expenditure following a clean balance so that we may know both how we stand. He had breakfast with the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who, mistakenly believing that Russell's criticisms of the conduct of the war must have been inspired by his having evolved constructive alternatives, disconcerted Russell by asking him what he would do if he were commander-in-chief of the army. After the war, Russell's dispatches were published in book form, and while awaiting new battles to cover, he went on a lectures tour. Clearly, it would have been hard for Russell not to have made a name for himself in the Crimea. This was the first time that a British army in the field had been subjected to any form of independent scrutiny, and it would have been difficult to miss its shortcomings. Russell certainly chronicled them, but he failed to understand and expose the causes. He concentrated his attacks on Raglan rather than on the system, not knowing that Raglan, a humane and sensitive man, in fact, he went himself in a snowstorm to take clothing and food to a corporal's wife who had given birth in a hole in the ground, had done his best to overcome the results of years of government neglect. Throughout the campaign, Raglan had made repeated requests for all manner of equipment and supplies to overcome deficiencies in the commissariat and the medical departments, but most of his requests had been ignored. When the public clamor led to a demand for a scapegoat, Russell's dispatches helped make Raglan a convenient choice. Although Russell criticized the lot of the ordinary soldier in Crimea, he was also careful not to hammer too hard at a comparison with that of the officers, whose social class he himself belonged. He did not write, as he could quite accurately have done, while the troops, ill-clad to weather a Russian winter, try to cease their hunger with a watery stew made of doubtful horse flesh. Tonight in the officers' mess the menu consists of soup, fresh fish, liver and bacon, a shoulder of mutton, pancakes with quince preserve, cheese, stout, sherry, and cigars. Above all, Russell made the mistake, common to many a war correspondent, of considering himself part of the military establishment. The one thing he never doubted or criticized was the institution of war itself. He had realized he had hit on the right note in criticizing the conduct of the war, and that his dispatches suited the times politics of the moment. Russell tended to toe the paper's editorial line despite his professional assessments. Perhaps the best summary of Russell's importance in the Crimea is by his colleague Godkin of the Daily News. Nearly 50 years after the war, Godkin, who had a distinguished career, wrote, "If I were asked now what I would say the creation and development of the special correspondence of the newspapers. The real beginning of newspaper correspondence was the arrival of Billy Russell with the English army in the Crimea. He was then a man of mature age, and had a long newspaper experience, and possessed just enough social qualities that were needed for the place. In his hands, correspondence from the field really became a power before which generals began to quail. I cannot help thinking that the appearance of the special correspondent in the Crimea led to a real awakening for the official mind. It brought home to the War Office the fact that the public had something to say about the conduct of wars, and that they are not the concern exclusively of sovereigns and statesmen. It is clear that before the war ended, the army realized that it had made a mistake in tolerating Russell and his colleagues, but by then it was too late. The war correspondent had arrived, and when the American Civil War broke out 5 years later, 500 of them turned out to report the conflict on the northern side alone." That's the end of the first chapter. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe.